Okay, we are reconvening public meeting number 41. And we'll straight to question 2. Should the commission issue guidelines for municipalities which may be a surrounding community to more than one host community? Ombudsman Ziemba.
I promise to be a little bit more brief in this presentation. The question is, should the commission issue guidelines for municipalities which may be surrounding community to more than one host community? And the recommendation is that the commission should take a look at the procedure to resolve disputes pursuant to MGL Chapter 23K, Section 17A. We've discussed those procedures already today, where the commission shall establish protocols and procedures to resolve disputes. And the premise of my answer is that if you really take a look at it, whether or not a community is a surrounding community to one community or to multiple communities, if there is a dispute, that it could be fully resolved, or potentially could be fully resolved within the procedure here. Right. What you may be concerned about is if a surrounding community might exhibit some preference to one or another host community, but if the commission establishes procedures so that it can evaluate that within the context of those procedures, and it establishes procedures to resolve any dispute, in many ways it's no different than a surrounding community that has a dispute with just one host community. So I think that the law already provides a method to take that into account and to resolve these disputes. So in that regard, I don't believe that it's really necessary to issue new guidelines for such situations, with a couple of noted exceptions. Earlier today, we heard that perhaps that the commission should institute a general good faith standard within its regulations, and the good faith standard would apply to applicants, host communities, but also potential surrounding communities. And that could be taken into account in either the application or in the context of a surrounding community which was not pre-designated as a surrounding community. That could be taken into account during the resolution procedure. So if it was ever demonstrated that there was bad faith, the arbitrator could take that into account in resolving the dispute as part of the evidence before the arbitrator. I think it's fairly unlikely, or it'll be rather rare, that you have a proven violation of the good faith standards. The example that I give is that even though a surrounding community may negotiate two distinctly different surrounding community agreements with different with applicants in different host communities, that may just be evidence that they were trying to get the best deal that they possibly could, and may not be provable as bad faith. Where it rises to the level if you have factors that indicate that one surrounding community is actively trying to sabotage another community's application, such as that there is never a distinct, concrete, finalized, executed agreement. That's where this bad faith standard could potentially come into play. The other recommendation is that the commission could consider as evidence if indeed one surrounding community executed an agreement with a favored, for lack of a better word, favored host community, but failed to execute an agreement with another host community, the applicant in that host community. Potentially, if there are similar types of impacts, the arbitrator could use as evidence any measures that that surrounding community agreed to in the executed surrounding community agreement with the other host community. So to put it more simply, if a surrounding community executes an agreement with one community, it agrees to a whole host of measures, but for whatever reason it fails to do so with another host community, the arbitrator could use the evidence of what was included in the executed surrounding community agreement in the process of resolving the dispute between the applicant and the potential surrounding community as part of that arbitration process. But beyond that, I don't see a need for further guidelines in this regard.
John, quick question. Why are you including the host community in the good faith standard?
Well, in disputes regarding, you're right, in dispute regarding surrounding communities and applicants, the procedure that we're utilizing, the 23 case section 17A procedure, I think that really only involves, as you're pointing out, only involves the applicant and the surrounding community, but that I included host community under the good faith standard, just for some of the reasons that I think we've discussed, that all applicants and communities should exhibit good faith in their dealings.
But there's there's no obligation for a host community to execute, to follow a good faith negotiation in its host community agreement.
Right.
They can do whatever they want, right?
Right.
So it would be a little, Commissioner Stebbins is right, I think.
Right.
It's a minor point, but I think in this context, it doesn't
Right.
really make sense. I can't even think of any, applicants that would apply, because they have to talk with entertainment venues as well as surrounding communities. But doesn't seem like host communities are really fit.
Yeah, unless a host community did something to disadvantage a particular surrounding community. But yeah, you're right, I don't have a concrete example.
Good.
What does good faith mean?
What does good faith mean? Let's say, Mr. Chairman, you and I did discuss a couple of examples. I'm trying to remember what some of those examples might
You
be.
mean well, do you mean what would it be designed to protect against, or how do you
What does it mean?
define it?
What does it mean?
I thought it was just like a reasonable man standard.
Yeah, well, for example, the example that I mentioned, that a surrounding community purposely sabotages negotiations
Applicant A over applicant
with a
B.
particular host community
Suppose
so that they cannot proceed to.
Suppose it did that because it felt that knocking out the first application would be highly beneficial to the town. That application A is much more favorable to the town than application B. So it uses its power to try and sabotage B for the good of the town. Is that bad faith? I'm not trying to cross-examine. I just wonder what utility on a cost-benefit basis
Yeah.
we get from adding a good faith standard as opposed to getting ourselves potentially into sort of satellite litigation over that standard, when most of the effects that we're trying to achieve by putting that standard in, i.e. the ability to use evidence of what you did in situation A
Right.
to prove that the agreement in situation B should parallel it, is available anyway.
Correct.
And it strikes me that a
Yeah.
good faith standard simply injects something that's both difficult to prove and of marginal utility.
Yeah, I mean, in my analysis, I state that it's very difficult to prove good faith standard. I guess perhaps in discussing the good faith standard, I was running with the premise of the question of here is an issue of a potential bad of some situation with surrounding communities that may have impacts on multiple host communities, and is there something that the commission should do about that?
Well, the statute says that if they can't agree, then we, again, have to have protocols and procedures for ensuring the conclusion of a negotiation of a fair and reasonable standard.
Right.
Right.
Fair and reasonable agreement, which
Right.
I was gonna ask, doesn't that already essentially take care of the good faith requirement? Seems like, but in any event, I think I don't know what does fair and reasonable mean? Would that, could surrounding community decide that the deal with A was better for them, so they simply flat out refused to do a deal with B, and thereby try to deny B the license? Would that be fair and reasonable?
It might not be fair and reasonable, but those are the statutory standards, and
Right.
it seems to me they're difficult enough Mr. Chairman.
So we don't
without
need to add-
adding another difficulty
Right.
on top of it.
I didn't realize, I
Yeah.
didn't notice about this fair and reasonable until you put it in here, until you
Yeah.
put the statute. But
Yeah.
it does sort of seem to me from that standpoint that it takes care of
Correct.
the case, the issue, the hypothetical you and I were talking about
Yeah.
is dealt with as well as it can get dealt with.
I think that's fair.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's because they're almost,
Yeah.
they could be seen as one and the same without injecting what is the
A new
definition of
factor.
good faith.
Right. Well, you've already got one bad enough we can't define
Right, I've
in
already,
this
yeah,
context.
right. I've already argued against trying to define difficult words.
Right.
Point well taken. So in that regard, the recommendation is that we rely on the process that's already established under
Right.
the general laws.
Right. Is there any further discussion?
I want to pick up on the judge's point because it does, I think, get back to the protocols and procedures that if ultimately the agreement can't be reached between one applicant and the surrounding community is drawing on the basis of an agreement they might have signed with another applicant. Not quite sure where I'm going with this. In terms of establishing the protocols and procedures, I'm surrounding community A, and for whatever reason, I think I'd get a good deal with applicant A.
Right.
So I negotiate an agreement that covers a mitigation of 5, 6 topics.
Mhm.
I'm not negotiating with applicant B for any number of reasons. Fair to say you take, at the appropriate point, whatever agreement I've done with A and say we're going to, commission could essentially say we want you to replicate that at whatever kind of timeline that
Yeah.
we're under. You know, if you're saying that roads, schools, water, whatever impacted, we could probably convey those at a minimum being in an agreement that essentially we would have to arbitrate or have to force with them to sign with the applicant that they don't want to deal with for whatever reason.
Right. No, right, so the recommendation is that you can take, if there is an executed agreement, in trying to determine what is a fair and reasonable outcome.
Right.
You can take the impacts and the measures to mitigate those impacts as evidence in determining what is a fair and reasonable conclusion.
This came up because of Munson, somebody at Munson, when I was in Western Mass. I think Munson either is or perceives that it might be a surrounding community to both a Palmer and a Springfield site. And somebody, and the person from Munson said to me, you know, what would we do in that situation? And I thought, I hadn't thought about that. That's an interesting question. I think I saw it written recently that Chelsea might be a potential surrounding community to either an Everett or an East Boston site.
Right.
And the same issue. So that is an interesting issue. What, you know, where this began was, what authority do we think is appropriate to vest in a surrounding community using a clause which was intended, I think, to do one thing, which is to mitigate the impacts of a casino on a community in a reasonable way, for another purpose, which is to exercise a significant role in deciding which of two competing organizations gets the nod. And it's an interesting question, but I think maybe what we've decided is, for good or ill, there is a mechanism, and it's as good as we can come up with.
Yeah.
And if it comes up in a cert, we'll just deal with it when the time comes,
Right.
and we'll have to figure out in the context what fair and reasonable means in a context which is probably not really anticipated by the drafters.
But don't we have built into this now the arbitration bit?
We haven't said that yet here,
Okay.
because it says we have to do protocols and procedures.
Yeah.
But in the live entertainment venues, we said it would be the, you appoint one, I appoint one, they appoint
Right.
one.
Right.
We haven't come up with that mechanism
Okay.
for this.
I missed it.
And I would recommend, I mean, I think that there are probably a lot of issues that we should consider in coming up with those protocols. We've heard from a number of applicants who've recommended that we should concentrate a lot of time and resources to getting that resolved as early as we can in the process. And I would recommend that as well. If you take a look at some of the, I'm not going to go into this because this isn't an item, but if you take a look at some of the amendments that were offered by legislators on the surrounding communities debate, there were a lot of proposals on how you finally resolve that debate between the applicant and the surrounding community. And one of the proposals was that you basically take the last and best offer from the community as the last offer. So there's a lot of, I'm not recommending that, but I'm saying that there are a lot of potential things for the arbitrator to consider, and maybe we would want to do it when we get into it further.
Yeah. But that's having to do with surrounding communities. This is on this very idiosyncratic case that we talked about, which
Yep.
is surrounding community to more than one host community, which is
Correct, yeah.
we don't even know if it's going to occur. So I don't know that we need to worry about the protocols and procedures for this section now.
Right, but they would just be encompassed within the surrounding communities' protocols and procedures. What I'm saying is
In
that,
effect, yeah.
yeah, just to
Yeah.
resolve the dispute
Yeah.
between two parties,
Right.
the procedures will be utilized so that there's no need
Right.
for a special regulation
Right.
applying to these
Right.
multiple.
Right. But we still don't, maybe I'm missing
We
the
still
point.
need to work on those protocols.
We still have to come up with a protocol and a
Correct.
procedure at some point. Yeah,
Yep.
right, okay. Okay.
Sorry, John. The comment I was making, I just noticed in the paragraph below. My apologies.
So do somebody want to move? I think we have a consensus here to adopt the recommendation as in the first paragraph, not including the second paragraph. And to encourage the ombudsman to think about protocols and procedures in good time.
So moved.
Second?
Second.
Right,
He needs a lot of encouragement.
right.
Come back and define in good time for us
Right,
at some point.
right. Any further discussion? All in favor of adopting question 2 as slightly modified, say aye. Aye. Opposed? Okay. It is adopted. All right, let's go to question 17. Once again, my issue, once again, offloaded. Ombudsman Ziemba.
So the question is, should the commission specify the minimum required content for a host community agreement? We heard some testimony regarding this issue yesterday, but I'll go through some of the comments that we received. Sterling Suffolk raised a number of issues. They have a rather lengthy answer on this question, but the general tenor is that the support for local control is baked into the Gaming Act, and that should be taken into account. Mass Audubon said that it is important to have baseline conditions for all community agreements. City of Boston, strong support for principles of local control. Paul Vignoli, yes. Philip Cataldo, yes. Martha Robinson, yes. But make sure that these minimums are the bare minimums, and that communities are free to add to them. Shefsky Froelich for the City of Springfield said absolutely not. It's inconsistent with the act. MAPC said yes, except it should be stated that the minimums can be exceeded. The minimums would be valuable in assisting smaller communities. City of Revere, no. They emphasize the principle of local control. Town of Bridgewater, yes. This would be helpful to the communities. Andrea Powers, yes. A common baseline would save time and money. MMA, Mass Municipal Association, no. No minimum, but the commission should advise communities upon request. We heard a lot of testimony yesterday regarding some of the issues behind minimum required content. I think I can briefly just actually read these. It might be worthwhile to read them. So arguments that the Commission should utilize its authority to review host community agreements as part of an application, but refrain from established regulatory minimums for the agreement, including establishing the minimum content of host community agreement presumes that the Commission knows better than the host community whether it should enter into such agreement and allow a gaming establishment into its community. The statute makes clear that the decision to enter into the host community agreement is with the host community itself, and the Commission has no rule in approving it prior to receipt of the gaming application. Creating regulatory minimums would impact the authority and responsibility of local governments to determine what is in the best interest of their citizens. Host communities are in the best position to evaluate local conditions that vary from other host conditions and regulatory minimums that may not be able to reflect local variances. Such standards may be subject to litigation and the attendant delay of litigation if they are deemed to be in excess of the Gaming Commission's statutory authority. Establishing minimums to regulation may cause participants to delay negotiating agreements until after the lengthy time required to promulgate regulations. Since regulatory minimums are by their nature minimum standards, host communities will seek much more robust and precise measures than possible in a regulation promulgated after months of deliberation and process. And once established, regulations take more time to amend if additional circumstances and information becomes available to warrant a change in any minimum standard. The statute establishes procedures so that citizens are properly informed about the host community agreement when they make a decision on the ballot measure. The Commission could issue best practices guidelines that host communities could consider in negotiating host community agreements. Host community agreements could be legally challenged if they do not meet the strictures of the language of the regulatory minimums. And finally, the statute includes numerous minimum requirements that an applicant must meet in order to be licensed. There are a number of arguments in favor of moving forward with minimum regulations. The extensive experience many applicants have with such agreements may place host communities at a very distinct advantage. Although resources are available to help host communities evaluate such agreements, host communities still may be at a disadvantage given the significant legal resources, other resources, and experience of applicants. The statute provides the Commission with the broad power and authority to implement the purposes of the statute. Minimum requirements establish a floor for negotiations for host communities. Guidelines do not have the force of law and could not be enforced by the Commission. Inadequate host agreements could lead host communities to rely on resources from the Community Mitigation Fund, increasing competition for funds which may be needed for surrounding communities or other communities and entities impacted by gaming establishments. The recommendation here is that the Commission should consider issuing guidelines regarding the minimum content for host and surrounding communities in the very near future, likely prior to January.
Skip surrounding. Surrounding's not on the table here.
Correct, but in the process, excuse me, it's not constrained to the question at hand, but in the process of coming up with the host advisory, it would likely, if the Commission so determines.
Well, we've already determined that we were going to come up with guidelines. That'll probably be regs for the surrounding communities. This is separate.
That's regarding the definition of factors to be considered of whether or not a community is a surrounding community. But a lot of surrounding communities have questions on what they should consider when they're considering surrounding community agreements.
Yeah, the content of the agreement.
But the question posed was host.
I will limit my remarks to host communities. Guidelines could be available in the time that it's anticipated that some communities may be nearing the completion of their agreements with applicants. The exception to the general rule is that we may want to consider some regulations within host agreements, and those regulations do not get at the specific mitigation measures that communities would be expecting to be included in those host agreements, but they would touch upon other issues that are important to the Commission. For example, the Commission could require that all host community agreements are subject to regulations or regulatory amendments that may be issued by the Commission, and that gets at regulations such as if a host community agreement involves an applicant that has been rejected by the Commission, that the Commission views that host community as null and void. Further, the commission could consider requiring provisions that make them subject to amendment if the basis of the mitigation plan is substantially and materially changed. The example that I give is that if a mitigation agreement is predicated upon a new interchange that must be approved by the state and by federal authorities, and that interchange is not possible, that potentially we might require a provision in host agreements that would require the parties to take that into account. Again, you know, the counter argument obvious to that is that local control means local control. So to the extent that the commission is extending itself into the host community agreements, that it should not do so, that the community should, you know, through their own deliberations, anticipate some of these factors that could come about, especially if a mitigation plan is dramatically different from that which they are negotiating. It would be in their interest to come up with such a provision, but it does not necessarily a community agreement may not have such a provision. But again, that's up to the community. That's what I have to offer.
Questions, thoughts, reactions?
Once again, I have some doubt as to whether we can do the kinds of things outlined here by guidelines, but as opposed to regulations. But let's put that to one side for a minute, because I think we need to have an exploration of that. We've already got a foundation for it, and within the next few days, I want to try and get something distributed to all of us so we're on the same page. But in my looking at this, I go back to this sort of three-pronged approach that it seems to me the statute lays out, that where the host community developer relationship is involved, that's really a matter for local control, as I look at the scheme. Where the host community, where the developer is working with the surrounding communities, we have a greater role to play to protect the surrounding community, and we have a much greater role to play when the regional content is concerned. And I would be very reluctant to prescribe minimum contents for the host community agreement. If they negotiate a bad agreement that we think is really terrible, when the application is presented, we can deny the license. If they negotiate a marginally bad agreement and then come to the Community Mitigation Fund to make up things that they should have considered when they negotiated the agreement, and take money from others who had no opportunity to be at the table, we can give the others a preference and say, you've got elected officials to deal with here, and you voted on this. The one part that concerns me, as you've correctly pointed out in this thoughtful memorandum, is what happens if we get a host community agreement that's premised on a major mitigation condition that proves impossible to fulfill because the permits can't be granted. What do we do then? And should we require a host community agreement to take account of that possibility? It seems to me that there are two ways to approach that. One would be to say, yes, there ought to be a provision in there, and that the disclosure to the community ought to say that this whole plan is contingent on a number of permits that are not yet in hand, so that the community understands what it's voting on. The second is that we ought to reserve, as maybe it's unnecessary to do anything to reserve, we probably already have the power, something for our exercise of power when issuing the license to put in conditions that unless a series of major mitigation effects come to pass, the license is void, and we will do further processing, which may include the requirement for another community vote. I don't know that we have the power to do that, but that's another approach to take. So, in summary, I think that apart from trying to deal with that contingency, the failure of a major mitigation effort, we should not require minimum standards in a host community agreement.
That's consistent with my recommendation. In regard to the guidelines, I think that is consistent with the role of the commission to provide educational, to provide education on issues to the general public and to communities to the extent that it can.
Yeah, and I'm all in favor of providing education and assistance. The question I have, and I think that we need to discuss a little bit further, is assume we promulgate guidelines, then can we deny an application, say, because the application, the host community agreement, doesn't meet the guidelines without having formalized the guidelines in a regulation? I'm concerned that we can't do that.
That's a very good point, and one that I didn't really consider for in this memorandum. The provision of guidelines was meant purely to inform local communities of the types of things that they should consider when they are doing their host community agreements. But you're exactly right. When you're putting out those guidelines, does that all of a sudden become a standard, but that the commission would utilize when evaluating host community agreements as part of its review? And the side that I ended up on was that it fits within the educational purpose of the commission, but you're right, it is a very tricky fine line distinction that deserves further consideration.
I see. Well, we may be able to put sufficient disclaimer language in there to make clear what we're doing and serve the educational purpose without creating a mechanism for evaluation.
Correct.
That becomes problematic.
Yeah.
We probably could do that.
We did it. We've done guidelines. We've done other guidelines.
Right.
We've done guidelines for schedule, for example, and all over it we said this is not illegal.
Right. Right.
I basically echo the Commissioner McHugh, and I've sort of changed my view on this. I think that the law gives, as the Commissioner said, very wide discretion relative to host community agreement, and it's different from surrounding and different from other things. And if we very much, and we are proactive on if communities want help, and the smaller communities do, and the larger ones tend not to, but if they do, we're there to provide it, and we provide it even-handedly. But it's such a small group of communities with which we can have regular, and you are having regular communication, that I'm not sure that publishing guidelines for host community agreements really adds very much. And if it runs the risk in any way of compromising us down the road, I wouldn't do it. So I lean against, and as I say, I've changed my mind on this, but I lean against any kind of formal guidelines. I'm in favor of communicating, and I would add, and I think when the proposal comes to us, we are the court of last resort. I think we could probably send, if we had a competitive proposal, and one of the competitors had what we thought was a good host community agreement, one was not, we could favor the one that was. That will clearly be one of the things we would consider. If we think a community is being taken advantage of or didn't do a good job of looking out for its own interests, we will take that into consideration. If we have a situation where we have no competition, just one proposer, we can send it back saying we don't like this host community agreement and we're not going to approve it unless you do such and such. So we do have the authority, as your document says, in the final analysis to make sure that we think, to weigh what's in the host community agreement. But prior to that moment, I agree with Commissioner McHugh that we should not. The issue of what happens in the event of a major material change in circumstance is sort of, I almost consider it a separate issue, because we haven't, it's a real issue. It has to get dealt with. But that's, I almost think we have to deal with that as a separate issue from this one. And maybe it turns out that is one guideline we issue, but I would sort of set that aside. We have many hands over here. Guy and Steve.
Here's a different question. I guess, in the context of the issue about what happens if there's a promise made in the agreement that can't be fulfilled. Two observations. One, this is going to a vote of the public, and I could imagine a voter looking at a proposition that says at the top, this may or may not happen. I mean, this is all subject to our getting all the permits, which is absolutely true. But why should they vote in favor of it? What are they voting on? Well, could that influence the vote in the sense that they're gonna say, well, tell me what I'm actually getting, and then I'll vote on it. Now, I don't know that that's ever really possible, because you have to have all these permitting procedures. But to the extent you emphasize that everything in this agreement is all subject to some future event, you may be discouraging people from voting for it. I'm wondering whether not necessarily telling the communities what they have to put in the agreement, but establishing some kind of form for the agreement that says, here are mandatory elements. These are things we promise you. This is what's going to happen. And here's some elements that we're going to try to do. These are things that potentially could happen. And at least the voter is given the full range of, given something that's substantial, that they can depend on, and then other things that necessarily have to be contingent. But I'm a little bit concerned, about presenting the public with a vote on something that's all potentially ephemeral.
Well, but that's really not, I mean, we're not saying that we should do that, and we're gonna talk about what's in the summary, late in a minute. But I don't think we're taking the position that you should say everything is contingent, but what we're saying is, what Commissioner McHugh and I are saying is, it's up to the host community to determine what is in the host community agreement. If they wanna say it's all ephemeral, that's their business. If they wanna say it's all for sure, that's their business. Steve, did you have?
Yeah, my point was
That's what we're
triggered
saying,
by,
I think, whether it's right or wrong, I don't know.
my point was triggered by something you said. If the commission determines that a host agreement at some point is unsatisfactory, that you could have them revise it. I'd point out that the host agreement is the predicate for requesting the referendum in the first place. So the public is going to be voting on something that you're now saying could be materially revised. I'm not sure you have the authority to do that.
No, it's a good point, but I think this goes to this, almost the same point we were talking about before. What happens if a major point in the host community agreement is not materialized, such as a massive new traffic interchange? That's a dramatic example that people presume.
But I'm saying that in
I know, we have a limit.
Considering the issue of whether you want to prescribe minimum standards, I don't want anyone to have the misimpression that you'll be able to correct it at a subsequent point. I think after the referendum takes place, your hands are pretty much tied.
Well, I think, as a practical matter, we would be making it a better deal for the community, so it's, but I hear your point.
Well,
I
not
get you.
everyone the public may have different reactions.
Yeah.
It's hard to speculate as
Right.
to what they would be.
Because the referendum is unique to the Commonwealth, don't you think that guards against a weak agreement with the host community? Don't you think it would tend to be somewhat inclusive because of the fact that the vote depends on it?
I think that it is so much speculation as to what the public is going to be aware of and what's going to cause them to vote in favor or opposed, that it's difficult to fathom all the possible scenarios.
I agree, but I think it would be, if we were speculating, it would be more likely that if you're trying to encourage someone to vote for you, you should give them more rather than give them less. And that would, if I had to, again, if I had to guess on what would happen, that'd probably be the outcome. But you don't know what as Steve points out, who knows what people want.
This also, it seems to me, and it's a side issue, but it's thrust to the fore by this discussion, it seems to me, for it illustrates the importance of trying to get the permitting process to move as quickly and synchronously as possible, because the number of independently moving pieces can greatly complicate the issue, particularly after a vote is taken. And we have to keep, and I know we are, and try and keep working on that and see what we can do to facilitate making that process work smoothly. Not sure we can do this by ourselves.
I just wanted to interject. Obviously, you don't have to reach this issue if the determination is made not to prescribe minimum requirements for host agreement. But if the commission were to find that you wanted to issue either regulations or guidelines, I would strongly suggest that the same arguments are applicable as was discussed in the finding of surrounding community, and that regulations are pretty much imperative as opposed to guidelines. Guidelines can be issued for education purposes, as you suggested, but not in terms of prescribing minimum requirements.
Yeah.
So we have, one thought I might, and again, I come down on the side that I think the statute was pretty clear in terms of local control and, granting authority, for them to negotiate a host community agreement. I guess the caution flag I would raise, and maybe this is simply even a responsibility for you as you deal with communities, is just to make sure communities are mindful of our evaluation criteria so that they don't put something in their host community agreement that, is something that we're going to have to judge under Section 18, and all of a sudden it could hamper the ability for us to approve their license application.
Yeah, and part of that is what I was contemplating when you put out these educational materials of here are the types of standards that would be important to the commission based on the statute. And then, there are a number of other issues of what a community should do in moving forward with their mitigation agreement, and are there best practices. Again, it gets to, I sort of addressed this in my memo, which is in any materials that come out of the commission, that it will be very difficult to make sure that they are even-handed. For example, even if we rely on third parties to provide examples of best practices according to whom? If you ask an applicant with experience around the country, they may say, well, that actually never even worked for the benefit of a particular community, that type of a provision. So we have to be mindful of all of those types of things when we put out our educational materials, or frankly, whenever I open my mouth. Whether or not it's written down or not is sort of a subset of the question. But I think that as we go forward and evaluate what we provide for educational materials, even if we're not voting today to publish those materials in January, perhaps we should think about that a little bit further, because every day when I'm visiting with host, and excuse me for talking about surrounding communities, but there's a wealth of questions out there, and some yearning for concrete advice in that regard.
And again, my suggestion is now again, I'm not sure I could see a scenario where a host community agreement would have some piece of the agreement that would fly in the face of what the commission is going to look for in an application. Right. But again, a recommendation, just a suggestion to a host community, just say, be mindful of what we're judging an evaluation on. And
in practice, a number of these host communities
an unofficial guideline, I guess.
Right. In practice, a number of these host communities are being represented by council, who are taking into consideration all of the considerations that we have to when the commission makes decisions. So
because we're sure the applicant is too.
Yeah, hopefully, yeah.
And there's a lot of description in the statute, right?
Correct.
There's lots of direction. I'm not sure if we could add much to what's in the statute in terms of general.
Well, I mean, I won't go into it here because it's sort of beyond the question, but there's all sorts of issues of should host communities engage in peer review of traffic impacts, or would they rely on the applicant? Those are the types of issues that we may ever never get to in an educational material, because it's a rather charged answer. But we know that communities all over the country do engage in peer review to take a look at traffic impacts. Whether or not we felt that was a recommendation as a guideline for people to consider, that would have to be considered based on input from all the parties. So it was a process that I recommended of putting out these educational materials, but I know how difficult it's going to be to come up with educational materials that are fair and balanced, for lack of a better word, and exhibit good faith by me and whatever other
take
standard.
that as an example. I mean, take that as an example. So if we had if we adopt your suggestion, which is that we do issue minimum content guidelines, would that question be addressed? You said that's something that comes up fairly often.
It comes up fairly often, and actually I have no idea what we would issue for. We might issue an advisory that you could answer it, that communities should consider whether or not they should engage in peer review based on the application that is provided to them at the time, demonstrating those impacts. If they feel that it's sufficient, it is a decision that the community should make. So you could potentially come up with something where the commission is not saying, we want you to engage in peer review, but you're at least getting it out there to host communities, surrounding communities, that this is a question that they should resolve for themselves in evaluating what they need to do for the host community agreement.
But, I mean, this is now we're getting off the focus of today's meeting. But couldn't we also achieve the same result at a lower risk if we got the regional planning authorities to take the laboring oar in some of this and help them to consider and promulgate guidelines like these that wouldn't be our guidelines, but that would draw on their expertise, their knowledge of best practices, their knowledge of local community conditions. They've already got a whole bunch of this stuff.
Yeah.
And for us to sit here and say we ought to have peer-reviewed this and that seems to me beyond our expertise. And we would be much better off to get these.
Well, there's a lot of expertise behind me.
No, I understand.
And scope, I would say.
The room is full of expertise. Everybody in the room is full of it. But
Thousands and thousands of dollars worth.
Yeah. But it seems to me systemically we'd come out with a better product if we got the established entities involved in this in a cooperative, collaborative way.
I think it's a very fair and interesting question, but again, we're weighing two competing interests. One is the clearly expressed interests of local control at the host community level in particular, versus, on the other hand, making sure that the best, most comprehensive, thoughtful planning takes place at the point of impact of a casino. And there is a tension between those two interests, but we can service this interest, the interest of appropriate planning and mitigation at the critical point of impact, by the technical assistance we're providing, by the RPAs who are actively involved and clearly have the resources, and we do have the fallback position when it finally comes to us. Taking that example, whether we need peer reviews, we'll have DOT looking at it ourselves. So it does feel to me like we don't have to compromise the local control principle because of something overriding, because we can there's plenty of ways to deal with the need to mitigate appropriately at the principal point of impact.
Right.
So when you weigh those out, I think I come down where the judge originally said.
Yes. Which is, in regard to requiring that, that's absolutely where my recommendation was as well.
Well, even on guidelines,
Yeah.
even on guidelines. I mean, I think there's plenty of other ways to get, with all the problems that guidelines have. I mean, one thing we talked about before you were hired was maybe there's something for you to think about where if you feel you make a material recommendation in response to a question or in your delivery of technical assistance, you could have your own place on the website, ombudsman questions. It says, I was asking Everett if I can do if they can do such and such, and the answer that I gave was the following. Mm-hmm. And I was asking Lakeville if I can do such and such, and the answer, that would be worth thinking about, just as a sort of abundance of caution to make sure that on really substantive material statements that everybody has equal access to it. But that I'd consider that maybe worth thinking about, but not guidelines and not minimums.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Just to follow up. We've been approaching this from the standpoint of making sure that the casino provides sufficient mitigation and sufficient benefit to the community. Following up on Commissioner Cameron's point, there is a similar likelihood that the casinos will promise too much. And does the commission intend to evaluate the host community agreements in terms of whether or not they're actually feasible? If your financial analysis of the casino application demonstrates to you that what the casino has promised to provide to the community it can't afford to provide? Would that be a factor in your analysis? And it's kind of looking at it from the reverse. And if that would be a factor in your analysis, is that something that they should know in advance?
I don't have a firm answer to that now, but I do think we need to consider that. I mean, I got off the bus every day for a while and looked at the hole in the ground that used to be Filene's, and the last thing we need is a hole in the ground someplace else around the state that was 5 times the size of it.
Right.
So I think that's a critical inquiry. The financial, but it fits into the financial viability
Right.
of the proposal, which is clearly in our wheelhouse
Right.
when we look at the overall application, I think. Somehow
I
we
have
have to
the-
come to grips with it.
Go ahead.
And that's
Actually,
happened in
we
other-
believe it is more likely that that would be the scenario, that they will overpromise as opposed to
Right.
that as far as the negotiations for the host agreement.
And that's happened in other jurisdictions, right? Where
Yes.
they promised and not delivered.
Right, especially if one applicant gets wind of what another applicant is doing when they're contesting for the same region. The scale of the bar will be raised to a higher level, and they'll keep making grandiose promises. And then it'll come before you, and then you'll make a determination that perhaps financially, it's not the viable project. And you feel that therefore the host community has been promised things that aren't going to be materialized. Well, now there's been a vote based on that host community agreement.
Yeah, I recall from our mitigation forum, one of the points that was made, strongly, I thought, was relative to finding ways, as a recommendation, really. This was the lady from Henderson, Nevada, recommending strongly that mitigation monies be done for mitigation purposes. That throughout these processes, communities find themselves, and applicants would oblige to essentially make a payment, a good neighbor payment, in lieu of trying to determine mitigation or mitigation needs, or maybe in addition to that, where we get into now the over promises. So, if nothing else, as a minimum in these agreements, I would like to the extent possible, try to define the two, articulate what is clearly a good neighbor payment, and what is for the purposes of mitigation, because there's at least those two components that would be part of potentially have a place in these agreements that, if nothing else, should be articulated. I would be the one minority, perhaps, in favor of trying to issue guidelines along those lines. They don't have to be very extensive, but best practices or whatever it may be. And I recognize local control, and there's a long history here in New England, but where there could be best practices, reminders, advisories, whatever we could issue. Some may be helpful to some communities, and some others may already have encountered, because they are, let's call a spade a spade. Our communities are different from one another. We have many of them, 351 cities and towns, and they are significantly different. Maybe not all the ones that will have or entertain a casino. So, just wanted to kind of state that for the.
On the point, when I go around and speak around the state, I often make the parallel to when I was involved in the cable television industry in its early days, when it was licensed by municipality, and the big municipalities that had a lot of households asked for impossible, outrageous things and forced the bidders to lie. And the only way you could win a contract was to just lie to beat the band. So everybody had a production studio in every neighborhood, and free basic cable for everybody for life, and on, and none of it would ever happen. And we are not interested in trying to set a standard that forces people, in order to win the licenses, to do something which they cannot do. And I make that a conscientious point. We do not want to make that kind of a standard here. whether we should make it a rule or a reg, that don't let over promises. But, I think if we're going to be pretty firm, at least by our standards, on the issue of letting host community agreements be the business of the host community, so long as it does not impede our process nor run the risk of impugning the integrity of the process, as long as that's the standard we're going to hold and stick to it, like on this issue, then I think we're going to stick with it. And we're saying if a host community comes up with a deal which is wildly over, we will be looking at the financial viability of these things, and we will probably pick somebody else. If they were not able to negotiate a deal, the applicant and the municipality, we're saying, you want to make a dumb deal? That's your right, make a dumb deal, but you'll pay the price when you get to us. I think that's kind of where we're coming down. Okay, so the, not maybe necessarily unanimous, but the question is, should the commission specify the minimum required content? We've moved far afield, but not too far afield. I think all this is very related. So I think we should call the question. Should the commission specify the minimum required content? Do you want to move for a host community agreement?
So moved.
No.
Should
Should they? Right. So the question is, you want to frame that question?
Yes, I move that the commission not require minimum content to a host community agreement.
Well, just for the should we amend that to say, because what John's recommendation was not that we have minimum content, but that we would consider, he said, issuing recommendations, guidelines. And I think we have now talked a lot about whether we want to do guidelines as well, or in lieu of minimum content. Do you want to put that into the same motion?
Surely. I'll withdraw the old motion and move that the commission has concluded that it will not specify the minimum required content for a host community agreement, nor will it issue commission guidelines for that content.
There was one exception, Mr. Chairman, that you mentioned, where if a regulation was necessary so that the work of the commission is not impeded by a host community agreement, that potentially could be considered. Potentially, that may never come to pass if the commission says, for example, the example that I gave, which the commission decides, hey, somebody didn't pass their license phase number 1, so they're not an applicant, so there's no importance to the host community agreement, so maybe imposing a regulation in that type of circumstance wouldn't amount to anything. But potentially there might be provisions in the agreement that would survive. I have no idea. All I was saying is that there might be situations where the commission, for its own purposes, might want to reserve itself some authority within the exception, but not getting into the business of what types of mitigation communities should get involved in or what they should require. So I think the exception that you were talking about was along those lines, but the general premise is that the commission should definitely not get involved in the content of host community agreements to the degree that it impacts mitigation measures and all the typical things that are included in mitigation agreements.
Well, I think the motion is what the commissioner said, which is no specification of minimum content and no commission guidelines to
with no exception?
Yeah, and there may be, and if I understood what you were saying right, there may well be a circumstances that comes up where we think something has happened in a host community agreement or in some other thing, which does violate the principles that we've established, impede our process, impugn the integrity of the process. In which case we would act on that, but I wouldn't see that as I don't see that as an exception to this motion. Maybe I misunderstood what you were saying.
Well, if you say that there shall be no minimum required content, but then you require something as content in the host community agreement, such as a provision that subjects the host community agreement to regulations or orders issued by the commission, there is minimum required content.
But if we pass this motion, we won't do that.
that's the point that I'm making. So if you're passing this motion, that provision that you were talking about would be prohibited by this motion.
But the remedy for that is not necessarily requiring that something go in the host community agreement. It's rejection of the agreement or a condition on the license that remedies the deficiency in the host community agreement, or a number of other things. This is simply a content regulation motion. And this says we're going to keep the hands off the host community agreement. We're not going to issue guidelines with respect to the commission guidelines with respect to that content, but it doesn't affect our right to reject an agreement that we think is impermissible, or to issue as conditions in the license any other remedial steps that we think are essential.
Yeah. And my point was just to mention that that is the idea that is on the table.
Yeah.
Commissioner McHugh, I would like, if you didn't mind, to split that vote into two different motions, because it has two components, one of which I favor and one of which I do not.
Okay.
The regulation and the guidelines.
Withdraw another motion.
I withdraw the motion, and here's a new motion. I move that the commission not specify the minimum required content for a host community agreement.
Second?
Second.
Is there further discussion?
Just for a point of discussion.
Want him to withdraw his motion?
No, I don't want him to withdraw any motion. Just to point out in the presentation John pulled together, and this goes back to my earlier comment about communities, again, being mindful of our approval process. You highlight a provision in Section 18. We will evaluate and issue a statement of findings, including the following objectives: mitigating potential impacts on host and surrounding communities, which I'm assuming the evidence we're going to use for that is whatever the host community agreement is. So, again, back to my point about communities being mindful of how we're going to have to make evaluated judgments.
Right. So that
Sorry.
no. So your point is the legislation is said all along what we're now saying, right? Which is that we already have the authority to use these criteria, right? Good point. Any other further comment? All in favor? Aye. Aye. Opposed? No opposed. Commissioner?
Second motion is that the commission not issue commission guidelines as to the minimum required content for a host community agreement.
Second?
Second.
Any further discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed?
Hey.
Nay. Commissioner Zuniga opposed. Okay. Now, the last one that I am responsible for and offloaded would be question 37. Do you need a break, or are you all right?
I'm good.
Rolling.
This is an
Okay.
easy one, hopefully.
Yeah. Well, I don't know.
You need a break?
Are you all right? You want a break? Okay. All right. Go ahead. Read the question.
Okay, question 37.
Oh, no, I'm sorry what this is. Yeah, sorry.
The question is, should the commission set election criteria for a local referendum if there are more than one project on a ballot? We received a number of comments related to this question. Sterling Suffolk said no. Massachusetts already has strong election laws. Philip Cataldo said yes. MGM Springfield said yes. The complexity warrants instructive guidelines. And then the further comment was that having all qualifying applicants on the same ballot makes sense. Shefsky Freilich, City of Springfield, said no. The ballot question and the referendum are best run at the local level with no need of assistance by the MGC. City of Revere said no. Campaign finance law, ethics law, and conflict of interest law already provide strict standards. Paul Vignoli said yes. In the analysis here, I think again, what I recommend the commission is that it looks to the general laws for the answer to this question. MGL Chapter 23K 1513 sets for a fairly simple standard that no applicant shall be eligible to receive a license unless a majority of the votes cast in a host community in answer to the ballot question on the gaming establishment my words, is in the affirmative. The language of the ballot question required by MGL 1513 is specific to each gaming establishment. So under this standard, even though there may be multiple applicants put on the ballot, each applicant must receive a majority vote in order to be considered for licensure by the commission. Since this is a fairly straightforward standard established by statute, there's likely no need for further criteria by the commission. Then I do some further discussion regarding potential designations of elections in a ward versus in a community. I think this is fairly unlikely to occur, so it doesn't deserve your time right now. The recommendation is, it's recommended that no further election criteria are necessary unless the commission becomes aware of a situation that is meant to unfairly prejudice any applicant's ability to receive a fair consideration through local ballot. Perhaps the commission may want to discuss, if it becomes aware of any situation, whether or not it would want to act on the local ballot. I'm thinking about that now, so perhaps it's not as straightforward as I once thought.
I think we need to explore that piece of this. What action could we take if we're not involved?
And basically what in this recommendation, I was saying, the commission shouldn't take any action on a ballot. If some situation comes up that the commission becomes aware of, then the commission would just simply consider whether or not it's within the authority of the commission at that time, and whether or not any actions the commission would take would be helpful. As mentioned in the comments, there are numerous election laws that govern, because my recommendation initially said that the commission shouldn't take any action. It didn't fully research any of those election laws to see if they would prohibit the commission from acting if it knew of any situation that would be difficult. But my recommendation is to continue on this recommendation, but if something happens, the commission could consider it at a later point after full evaluation of the election laws and its authority. But since that circumstance may never come about, perhaps this isn't really necessary to use the commission's resources at this time.
Would that pretty much fall into the same standard as if the commission thought there was something inappropriate going on in an election where there was only one on the ballot? In other
Correct.
words, we sort of always would have
Correct.
the right to consider whether we can take a step if we think there's something wrong in the election.
Absolutely.
So this would be
Within the context of the election laws, et cetera,
right.
et cetera.
Exactly.
Yep.
John, I'm assuming election law defines, let's say for a community that may have more than one proposal, election law defines how an individual is able to vote. If multiple, let's say, take Springfield for instance, Springfield puts both items on one referendum ballot.
Right.
Election law guides how a voter can vote on those ballot items, whether they can vote for one, vote for two. I mean, that's all pretty much guided by the election law?
What's anticipated in the answer to this question is that if the question is put forward in the manner that it is put forward in the statute, that it's specific to that applicant, and then voters either vote yes or no to that question that relates to that applicant. So if it's a majority vote of the voters on that specific question, then they can come forward for licensure by the commission.
But I think that the answer to your question may be what's in the Gaming Act, which is the review by the city solicitor that provides the summary that goes into the question. And the question is prescribed in a section.
No, it wasn't necessarily related to summary. There are two items as a voter. Am I limited to vote on one and not the other? But
Right.
I think I answered my own question. I think election law would probably follow suit and
Well, this
be
plus
able to vote.
yeah. Well,
Both questions.
I mean, take the Springfield situation. If the mayor, I guess it is, decided to put both on the ballot, and it would have to go through the same question, how the question would be framed is specified. There would be a summary as specified, but the mayor might then also choose to say, tell us which one of these two you prefer. And I guess that would be fine, right? Is there any?
I don't think so. I think it's a yes or no question pursuant to
Well, I know
the
it's a
Act.
yes or no on that, but why, could the mayor have a third question? So in other words, the community votes, a majority votes yes on both.
I see.
But on a second vote, which is, do you prefer site A or site B, so that the mayor knows which one he wants to bring to the commission,
Sort of like as an advisory question, a local advisory
which the
question.
mayor would say he would follow, right? That's the only way I can think of
Well,
it.
there's another one. There's vote for however many you want. Vote for one or for two, if you want to vote yes, or vote for
But it
no
would be a
on
third
either
question.
one.
It would be a third question,
It could be structured as two.
yeah. As two questions?
Yeah.
How would you do it with two?
Two proposals, vote yes or no on either one or both.
Yeah, but you might not get no majority for anything. Yeah, right, okay. But anyway, I think the answer to your question was, at this stage of the game, there's enough law out there, whether it's this law or other election law, that we don't need
I was
to.
just wondering if it was treated similar to when you have a ballot, a normal election year, you have a ballot with several referendum questions. You're not limited by which referendum question you can vote on. You have the opportunity to vote for both questions.
Maybe the general laws. I'll just read very quickly what it says. It says that at such election, the questions submitted to the voter shall be worded as follows: shall the city or town of blank permit the operation of a gaming establishment licensed by the Gaming Commission to be located at blank?
Right.
Yes, no.
Yeah.
So that puts forward a very straightforward
Right.
yes,
It's-
no
I'm-
on that one question.
I'm probably not making myself clear. In looking at the ballot, if, again, the city of Springfield decides to put both applicant questions on the ballot,
Yes.
is the voter, essentially, I think election law guides us, the voter is allowed to go in and vote on each applicant's question.
Yes.
So not like, okay, I can only restrict my vote to voting yes or no on applicant question number one, and I can't vote on applicant question number two. I'm just trying to clarify that
No,
I can vote on both of those questions, regardless of what it says. I just
Yeah.
want to make sure that election law, I believe, allows, kind of guides that principle of, here's the question, I can vote yes or no, go down to the next question, I can vote yes or no. Sorry, I'm kind of,
No, I
That
don't
makes
know
it
of
up.
a circumstance. So you're saying, would there be some instruction in the ballot that says
Pick one.
you can only vote for one of the two following questions that have been worded?
right,
I don't know.
I don't think there's a restriction to that.
I don't know why they couldn't say that. I mean, but.
I don't know the answer to that question either, but aren't there a whole range of scenarios that one could envision if there's more than one vote? You could have two separate elections. You could have sequential elections. The mayor of a town that's got two could say, this is my favorite, let's see if this flies. If it flies, that's the one I'm going with. If not, we'll put the second one to a vote. I mean, he or she could do that. They could put both on the ballot and say, vote for both. Do you approve both? And then I'll decide. They could put two on the ballot and say, I want you to say yes or no, but I want you to say yes or no as to the one of the two you prefer.
Could have two ballots.
You could have, with the other one, you could
Two
have
ballots.
two, vote for yes, and then an advisory question, which one do you prefer? I don't see how any of that, so long as the summary is fair, and the ballot otherwise complies with section 23K 1513, how any of those methods would be impermissible. I mean, if there's some doubt about that, we better do some further research on the election laws, but it's,
Well, yeah, I think we're trying to answer a hypothetical that, we have no idea what they're gonna do. I
Right,
think
right.
when presumably, if Springfield decides to deal with this, or some other community deals with this, they will do their own research. They will try to find within the law a way to answer the question. If we see they've come up with a mechanism that we're not comfortable with, we can then act. But I think to go any further to try to figure these
That was
crazy.
my recommendation,
Yeah,
that
right,
if
right.
if some circumstances come up where the commission
Right.
decides that it's truly not a fair and reasonable result, then we should
Right.
analyze it at that point.
Right.
But
I agree. Okay, so, somebody want to move, we're accepting the recommendation, at the word, necessary.
Move to accept the recommendation, no further election criteria are necessary.
Second?
Second.
Any further discussion? You got any more questions?
I'm good.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Nay? Opposed? Nay. All right. I was thinking this was the question that we talked about yesterday, which was, should we approve the summary? But I'm now remember that whether we should approve the summary is a 3, and that was the 3, Commissioner McHugh, that I thought should be moved up to this week if we can. But nobody's dealt with that one yet. But it's been discussed a lot. Maybe I'll try to take a crack at it if I can, and see if we can get it on the agenda for Friday. Because it's not terribly time sensitive. We've got time to deal with it, but there's enough conversation going on about it, and it relates to all these local control issues that I think it would be good if we could join it before the week is out. So if I can get around to it, I will. If not, we'll get to it when we get to it. So we've got question 31 to go. I am going to suggest we take a brief break, since half the group has already anyway. We'll see you in 5 minutes.